America, the land of liberty, the home of the brave, a place that supposedly began with an idea, freedom for all. But what if that idea was never the foundation at all? We've been told a story, a clean, simple, heroic story that starts in 1776 with powdered wigs, parchment, and passionate speeches about liberty. But the truth is far more complicated, and a new documentary lays it bare. This film doesn't just retell history, it dissects it. It challenges the very bones of our national memory and forces us to ask, not what happened, but what we've been told happened. The narrative we learned in school starts with the colonies as victims of tyranny, as brave revolutionaries standing against the British Empire. A fight for justice, autonomy, and equality. But that version skips over something critical, something that came over 150 years before the Declaration of Independence. In 1619, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying the first enslaved Africans. The documentary argues this is where the true American story begins, not in Philadelphia, but at Point Comfort. Not with freedom, but with forced bondage. Slavery wasn't incidental to America's rise. It was foundational, okay? And the film traces, with sharp clarity, how labor extracted from black bodies built the nation's economy, its infrastructure, and even its philosophy of freedom for some. The film walks us through chilling documents, shipping logs of human cargo, records of auction blocks, plantation accounts showing profit margins. It's undeniable. Slavery wasn't a footnote, which was the business model. It challenges the view that 1776 was a bold rejection of tyranny. In fact, many colonists feared British policies that hinted at abolition. The revolution, for some elites, was not just about taxes, it was about protecting slavery. This isn't speculation. This documentary draws on letters from colonists, political pamphlets, and economic data. We see how Southern leaders, especially in Virginia and the Carolinas, had a vested interest in maintaining the slave system. And yet, the founding documents, soaring with ideals, ignored this contradiction. All men are created equal, Jefferson wrote, while enslaving hundreds of people. It's a truth that many still struggle to reconcile. The documentary doesn't stop with the founders. It moves through the construction of national myth. We see how, in the 1800s and beyond, textbooks began to reshape history not for accuracy, but for unity and nationalism. Post-Civil War, there was a movement to reunite North and South often at the expense of truth. The lost cause narrative emerged, romanticizing the Confederacy, downplaying slavery, and portraying the Civil War as a noble fight over states' rights. Schools across the South adopted these myths. Children grew up reading about faithful slaves and Southern gentlemen. Generations were taught a version of history designed to comfort, not challenge. The documentary doesn't just blame the South, shows how across the nation, even in the North, there was silence, avoidance, and sanitization. White America, it argues, needed a heroic past to justify its power in the present. But marginalized communities kept the real stories alive. To oral traditions, songs, black newspapers, church sermons, the truth didn't disappear, it was just ignored by the mainstream. Then came the 20th century. The Civil Rights era forced a reckoning. But even as schools began to include Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, the deeper story, the systemic one, was still left out. The film cuts to interviews with black scholars who have spent decades fighting to insert these stories into the national narrative. Some are exhausted, others are energized. All agree, this is a battle for the soul of the country. The most haunting scenes are classroom montages. Teachers trying to discuss slavery and getting pushback from parents. School board meetings erupting over critical race theory. Students saying, "I never learned this before." Because this isn't just a historical debate. It's political, emotional. It's about identity. For many Americans, questioning the founding feels like questioning the flag itself. But the documentary argues, true patriotism isn't blind loyalty. It's honesty. It's being willing to see the cracks in the marble and still saying, we can build something better. It introduces the 1619 Project, not as a replacement for 1776, but as an expansion, a reframing, one that centers the enslaved, the dispossessed, the forgotten, and with that comes backlash. We see politicians railing against it, governors banning certain books, media figures calling it divisive. But the film asks, divisive for who? The people finally being seen, or the ones who prefer them invisible? It also touches on indigenous histories, how tribes were displaced, lead to, massacred, and then erased from the story altogether. Maps redrawn, treaties broken, names stolen. But it's not just about tragedy. It's also about resistance, native uprisings, slave rebellions, hidden literacy, underground networks. Every silence group had its own form of revolution. The documentary is careful not to glorify suffering. Instead, it honors survival. It celebrates voices like Phyllis Wheatley, the first black woman poet published in America, and Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who tried to unite tribes against expansion. It shows that America was always a contested space, a land of dreams and nightmares, of hope and hypocrisy. The people who built it did so not in unity, but in struggle. By the time we reach the final act of Part 1, the message is clear. The story we were taught was partial by design. It was written to create cohesion, but at a cost. And now, that cost is being felt in racial disparities, in cultural divides, in political warfare over whose story gets told. We're not just arguing about history, we're arguing about reality. But this isn't where the story ends. The documentary leaves us with a cliffhanger, a classroom scene. A teacher asks, what if America's real birth wasn't in 1776? But every time someone fought to make it more just, cut to black. The narrator says, to understand the future of America, we must return to the places history tried to erase. The story doesn't end in the past. In fact, the past is just the beginning. As the documentary picks up, we're not in 1776 or 1619 anymore. We're in the 20th and 21st centuries, where the consequences of that selective origin story still echo. America has spent generations building its self-image on a narrow version of history. But the people left out of that version, indigenous, black, immigrant, and working-class Americans, have always told a different story. Cocoon, the film, opens Part 2 with a striking image, side-by-side footage of 4th of July parades and civil rights protests. Both groups claim to love America, but they remember it differently. We revisit the post-Civil War era. Reconstruction was meant to be a rebirth, a chance to rebuild the South with justice, equity, and democracy. But within a decade, it collapsed. White supremacist terror, voter suppression, and Northern indifference brought it to a brutal end. Jim Crow laws replaced it. Lynchings soared, schools were segregated, yet textbooks rarely told this part of the story. Instead, they focused on reconciliation and painted the Confederacy in a noble light. The documentary shows how Hollywood played a role too. Films like The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind romanticized the Old South. They influenced not just pop culture, but public memory. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement that the sanitized story began to crack. Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., these figures forced America to confront its contradictions. But even then, only the most palatable parts of their legacies were mainstreamed. Dr. King's radical economic and anti-war views ignored. Malcolm X's call for self-determination feared. Black Panthers offering free breakfast to kids demonized. And so, history was repackaged again. Safe, selective, patriotic. The documentary argues this is what America does best, not hide its flaws, but dilute them into digestible myths. But there were always people pushing back. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States challenged dominant narratives. Activist historians began to reframe curriculum Black educators kept history alive in communities where public schools refused to teach it. Then came the 21st century and, with it, a new battlefront, the classroom. Suddenly, education was political again. School boards began fighting over which books to ban, which names to mention, and which truths were too divisive to be discussed. We see footage of parents shouting at teachers, accusing them of brainwashing children. The term critical race theory became a catch-all weapon used even when no one could define it. The documentary interviews students, shunned, curious, frustrated. One girl says, "I just want to know what really happened. Why are adults so scared of the truth?" That's the heart of it. The fear. The idea that if we teach America's full history, the country itself will unravel. But the film flips that idea on its head. It argues that without truth, we've built our unity on sand. It explores how the lies of the past enabled the inequalities of the present. Redlining didn't happen in a vacuum. Mass incarceration has roots in slavery. Wealth gaps trace back to land theft and labor theft. And yet, most Americans are never taught this. They're told slavery ended, civil rights happened, everything's fine now. But the data says otherwise, and so do lived experiences. Then the film poses a powerful question. What if history isn't just something we learn, but something we live through every day? The scenes shift to protests after George Floyd's murder, monuments to slaveholders being torn down, a national conversation erupting not just about police, but about power, systems, and yes, history, and with it, backlash. Again, states rushing to pass laws to protect patriotic education. Public figures framing historical truth as a threat to traditional values. But the film highlights a new wave of educators and creators using books, podcasts, social media, and film to fight back. They're not rewriting history, they're restoring it. You meet teachers developing decolonized curriculums, activists collecting oral histories in underserved communities, young people using TikTok and YouTube to tell the stories they never saw in school. The documentary doesn't pretend this is easy. Telling the truth means discomfort. It means grappling with guilt, grief, and the burden of stolen stories. But it also means liberation for the descendants of the oppressed and for the oppressor's descendants too. 'Cause when truth rises, healing can begin. It explores how Germany memorialized the Holocaust not with silence, but with monuments, education, and accountability. The US, by contrast, has more statues of Confederate generals than memorials to lynching victims. So the question becomes, what kind of country do we want to be? One that worships myths or one that builds justice on memory? As the film nears its final act, it returns to 1619, to the beginning of America's real origin story. It's not there to replace 1776, but to stand beside it, to expand it, to deepen it. Because freedom didn't start in one moment. It started with every person who resisted, every slave who escaped, every woman who marched, every student who questioned the textbook. And now it's our turn. The film ends with a final image. Children walking through a museum, Exhibit 1, that shows both Jefferson's desk and the slave cabin. A plaque reads, "This is where America began, and where it must begin again." A voiceover closes. History is not a weapon, it's a mirror. And when we finally face it, maybe we'll see the country we could become.